All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone, for being here today for our seminar. Just a reminder, this is a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room, and I want to just thank you both. My name is Cinnamon Moffat, and I will be one of your hosts for today. For folks online, just like always, if you have been with us before, your mics, cameras, and screen shares have been disabled, but we have a volunteer in the room, Roseanne. Thanks, Roseanne, who will help with any questions that you might have. So please put those questions into the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of today's presentation. For folks in the room, we've been doing this for a little while, but if you are a student taking this for credit, make sure you sign in on that special sign-in sheet out on the sign-in table. That way we know that you're here, and everybody else, thank you so much. When we get to the question and answer, if you haven't been here with us before, make sure you raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic so that everybody online can hear as well. So I have a couple of quick announcements, and then I'm going to hand it off to today's speakers. But I wanted to start by just letting folks know that next week we have our next Science on Tap. And so we have two this month. We had one at the beginning of October and then this one at the end of October. So Julia Parrish is going to come and talk to us about some of her work. And so if you all are interested, it'd be really great to come at 6 p.m. next Wednesday. Julia Parrish does the Coast Dead Bird Survey and some of the marine debris surveys. So she's going to talk about her results. And then the following day, she's actually going to come back and talk to us a little bit more about the mer population. And will kind of set us up quite nicely for that seminar at our research summit last week. And so Julia is going to come and talk a little bit more in depth about the changing population of the MERS here in Oregon. So for both of those events, I hope you join us. But for today, Mauricio Cantor has been the individual who is hosting today's speaker. But before I hand it off to Mauricio, I just want to say thank you for all the amazing speakers that you've been bringing to us lately. If you know, Mauricio's brought like 4 people to us over the last couple of weeks. And so he has been my co-host on this event for a lot. So I just wanted to slow down and say thank you very much. And then I'll hand this off to you, Mauricio.
Hi again. Thanks, Cinnamon. Hello once more. So I'm here today, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you. Today's guest, Dr. Rodrigo Tardin. He's an assistant professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where he leads the Marine Ecology and Conservation Lab. So Dr. Tardin's research focuses on impact of climate, oceanographic, and human factors on apex marine predators, particularly on aquatic mammals, from river dolphins to offshore whales. His research group uses many non-invasive field techniques to study these species along the Brazilian coast. And in addition to his academic role, Dr. Tardin is also a researcher with the Climate Network on Biodiversity and Ecosystems. So Rodrigo is here today with us in Hatfield, thanks to a 3-month visiting scholarship that he got from the Brazilian government to be here. And it has been a great pleasure for me to host him in my lab here at the Marine Mammal Institute. So in the past months, we've been collaborating. He has been collaborating with others at MMI as well on several projects, including many grant proposals to perhaps come back or send some of us to Brazil to assess the cumulative effects of anthropogenic stressors on marine predators, and with all of this, aiming to advance local conservation and management strategies. So today, Rodrigo, or Dr. Tardin, will present an overview of his research, and then he'll follow by recent findings on the impacts of climate change on coastal dolphins. These results are fresh from the oven. He just submitted or resubmitted the paper. Yeah, and these results are drawn from one of the most comprehensive data sets on Guiana dolphin occurrences along the entire distribution of the species. And this will be used to explore how different climate scenarios might shape the future distribution of the species. So just compiling this huge database that comes from many researchers in multiple countries from Central and South America, is no small feat. And this is something that only a very collaborative, kind, and social person could pull together. So for those who interact with Rodrigo in the past months, will come as no surprise that he managed to do this. And yeah, thanks for combining all of us, especially the new generation of more collaborative researchers. And yeah, and I think my own hypothesis for this, for his success on that, for his collaborative, social, and kind nature comes from his own super big family with 7 siblings, 7 dogs, 7 cats, 3 dogs, and control some control some dolphins in there too. So all of that helps him, I believe. So yeah, without further ado, so let's give a warm welcome to Professor Rodrigo Tardin. Take it away.
Do you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Mauricio, for this great introduction. Yeah, that's true. I have a big family for animals and humans. So that makes things easy. Yeah, so I think today the idea is to talk a little bit about of this research, but as Mauricio said, I think would be an interesting opportunity to just, oops. Okay, just to talk a little bit about what we've been up to in Brazil and in our lab, what we've been doing. These are some of the species we have been working on. So humpback whales on the breeding ground, bottlenose dolphins, but I will mainly focus for most of this presentation on this both species here. Let me see if I get the pointer. Yeah, so Guiana dolphins and Bryde's whales. So I think the main line of research that we are interested in our lab is to understand how the environment, and especially how the multiple anthropogenic stressors influence marine mammal behavior and spatial ecology. But to understand that, I think we have to look at 2 spatial scales. We have to look at a local scale, but we have several challenges, very interesting challenges, but also at global scales. So because of that, I divided my presentation in 2 parts. So in the first part, I'll try to give a quick overview of what we've been doing, especially with Guiana dolphins and Bryde's whales. I'll try. There's a lot of stuff, but I will try to wrap it up. And the second part is this recent study we did on the effects of climate change on Guiana dolphins. But first, of course, I have to thank these incredible people. It's been amazing work with them. So many students, colleagues, friends that I've learned a lot throughout all of these years in fieldwork, in conferences, having fun on every day. And of course, all the funding. Mauricio, thank you for talking about the internationalization program. And this is the first logo there. That's why I'm here. I received this fellowship to be here, and I just want to do a quick thing about this is that that is being really a pleasure to be here. I'm feeling very welcome, and you guys since the beginning were amazing. It's such a unique environment where everybody talks to everybody. So thanks, you guys are awesome, and so it's been very good being here. Okay, so what can we talk about this local scale? So for those of you who don't know Rio is a state in Brazil, in southeastern Brazil. And there we work in 2 different areas. This southern Rio de Janeiro state, where we have Guiana dolphin populations. And this is northern Rio de Janeiro state, where we have the Bryde's whale population. So I'll try to give a quick overview of how we are trying to answer these questions in this local scale. So in the northern Rio de Janeiro state, we have a very interesting ecosystem that it has a seasonal upwelling during spring and summer, mainly driven by winds. And because of that, it's a very productive area. It's a very beautiful area. So we have a lot of tourism, but also a lot of fish. And since there are a lot of fish, then drives a lot of marine mammals there. And Bryde's whales, as many of you know, in several parts of the world, I guess, they are much more offshore than coastal. But in this area, they are really coastal. They're really close. So it kind of makes a unique opportunity for us to study them. but they are incredibly hard to follow, to do everything. So we for 10 years now, I guess, we are been studying them, and we understand that it's a seasonal resident population that uses the area mainly for foraging, but we have been seeing animals, pregnant females. We saw really small babies. So this area is really important for them. We don't know if they migrate to any place. We're trying to understand that. Brutus whales usually don't migrate, but we have been seeing them from late November to June. Yeah. And we have seen several of these kind of cool behaviors. This is a foraging behavior that we saw and describe it, where the Brutus whales open its mouth and then kind of do a 360 degrees twist while trying to feed from sardines. But there's a lot of more that we want to know about them. And so we're trying to understand, especially how do they overlap with all of these multiple stressors there? How do they overlap with fishing, with tourism, with other things that are happening there? And especially how noise influences their behavior. This is Israel, a postdoc that works with us, and he's mainly interested in this noise aspect. And we're trying to tag them. Really hard. We have kind of 3 campaigns trying to do that. We learned a lot. That was very good. And we tagged at least 1 whale. Okay, that's a small victory, but it's a victory. But we need much more data. We need much more funds, and the equipment, they're so expensive. We have to try to get funds for that. And so, as Mauricio said, we kind of are in this way. So here we submitted 2 grant proposals for 2 Brazilian funding agencies. So the 4 of us here, we were celebrating the submitting. I hope we continue to have these happy faces when we got accepted. But yeah, so that's very good. And we're trying to ask, actually, with that body condition aspects, if different individuals may be more vulnerable to these stressors. And the same aspect that we're trying to do in this project, we're trying to get through the Guiana dolphins too. So this is going to be a very awesome project, and I hope we can, fingers crossed, I hope we can get accepted so these guys can come to Brazil, and hopefully I can come back too. But that's it. I think that's a good question that we have, and we're trying to answer for Brutus whales. But what about the stars of this afternoon, the Guiana dolphins? So looking at the local scale first, before we talk about the global scale, in Rio, we have 2 populations, this southern Rio, as I said, that lives in very different environments. So in terms of anthropogenic stressors, they are usually large populations here that use the area for foraging and for parental care. So for those of you who may not know very much about Guiana dolphins, they're these very nice dolphins, very shy, very challenging to study. It's almost impossible to biopsy them. It is impossible to tag them. So we are trying to get more data about them, because since they have a very coastal habit, they are usually living in these bays and estuaries, and many times associated with mangroves. They are almost always overlapped with different human activities. So in Sepetiba Bay, in this right part of the map, we have a very intense situation, especially in the last decade. The increase in port infrastructure was crazy in the last decade. So we have fishing too, but it's in local scales, artisanal scale. But all of this infrastructure and a lot of ships increased a lot in the last decade. So last year, we published a paper about it, trying to understand how much it changed in some behavioral parameters. So here you guys can see what we did actually was trying to compare the data we have now to 20 years ago. So we saw a significant amount of decrease in group sizes. So 64% decrease in group sizes, 85% in vocalization. The animals are almost never communicating anymore. And when they do vocalize, when they do whistle, they do in less noisy areas. So We're trying to understand how it can influence their behavior there. And due to overfishing especially, dolphins are getting very skinnier each time. This was the first attempt we have this body condition study, and we're trying to with photo identification, and we've seen some pretty common now to see these dolphins with these conditions. And on top of that, from November 2017 to March 2008, we have a morbillivirus outbreak during 5 months that started in Ilha Grande Bay, the other bay that is connected to Sepetiba Bay, that killed 80 individuals there, but somehow dispersed to Sepetiba Bay, and then there it killed more than 200 individuals in 5 months. So that shows us how immunosuppressed this population is. So of course that this is a huge event there, and we're trying to understand what happens now. How is the population size and demographic parameters affected? Did the outbreak somehow influence the social structure of that population? That's the main reason I'm here, actually, to work with Mauricio in that. So we're trying to think a little bit about that and trying to follow these steps. So this is Sepetiba Bay, and when we think about Ilha Grande Bay, that other connected bay, things are pretty good. Despite the outbreak, despite the increasing stressors, the population seems to be large groups, large population feeding all the time. So that's good news, I guess. But despite that, when we are thinking about different populations along Guiana dolphin distribution, we see that several of them are facing unprecedented challenges. Several of them are facing overfishing, port activities, tourism, shipping, several stuff. So when we think about that and increasing the scale, we need to think globally. We need to think at a whole different scale. And that's why we go to this second part of the presentation. So what challenges these dolphins face when we are thinking in this scale? And one challenge that we have to think at this scale is climate change. Because climate change most likely will affect the fisheries, where the fish is, where the fishing effort is going. It most likely will affect the shipping lanes, the pollution, especially pollution from land, because it will increase the runoff of a lot of chemical pollutants to the sea. It will increase in noise, even noise in terms of climate change, in terms of how the speed of the sound and the exposure levels will be. So it will affect several aspects, will exacerbate these human stressors, right? And of course, ultimately will affect Guiana dolphins. So as many of you know, climate change, I think it's one of the biggest challenges we have in this century, and it's getting the waters warmer with less oxygen and more acidic. We have been already observed and predicting several consequences. We already have been seeing loss of animal biomass. So in this study, if you follow the red line here, we can see that we already are observing the loss of animal biomass. And if we go along with this x-axis here, it's predicted to get worse as climate change intensifies. And at the same time that we are losing animal biomass, we're also losing species richness, especially on the equator area, because species are getting on their thermal limits there. So these are evidences that we are observing and we are projecting to get worse in the future. And one aspect of climate change that I've been interested about is on how biodiversity are redistributing in these scenarios, how species are shifting their ranges to track their suitable climatic conditions, and how these somehow are affecting ecosystem health, climate feedbacks, and human well-being. So there's a lot of interesting studies about that. And we think on climate change on marine mammals, we have a bunch of studies already observing and documenting current conditions, current effects, but we have a wide spread of effects that can happen with these animals. So all of these global changes with physical and chemical changes in the oceans, we already seen several manifestations of these effects. And as I am saying throughout the presentation, they're expected to get worse. So foraging success, the increase in disease, the loss of pinniped, pupping habitat, and so on. And if we have these effects on the individual, this will escalate to population level consequences. So it's important for us to understand and especially try to predict what is going to happen in the future so we can do something now. And at least as far as I know, this was one of the first studies that tried to think about how climate change would redistribute, would shift species, marine mammal cetaceans range changes. This is a theoretical study, so it's not modeled, it's not quantitatively predicting, but it already gives us a very good clue about it. So in this map, on this first column, these are the current distribution of some species with certain attributes that we'll talk about. And here is how they will change. So in this first panel, we have the species that are limited by cold water. So the prediction is that these species that are limited by cold water will have range contraction in poles. The species that are limited by cold water and warm water too will have a poleward movement. And we are already observing that, not only for cetaceans, but for sharks, for turtles, for fish in general, several other species. And the species that lives and has their optimum climatic habitats in tropical areas, it's predicted to have a range gain because the waters are getting warmer and they will track these warmer waters. This is a process that has been called as tropicalization. But most of the studies, they are concentrated in polar and temperate marine mammals, and that makes a lot of sense. Just bringing two examples here. This is a great study of Katharina Peters and colleagues in New Zealand, where she predicted poleward movements by sperm and blue whales. They're predicted to lose habitat in the north part of the island and getting more and more habitat here. But beyond prediction, we are already observing some of these changes in range in movements, such as the narwhals. So here we have a graph where we have the departure dates and different decades. And if you guys look at the pink box plot, there are females. We are seeing that at each decade, the females are delaying departure from foraging grounds as water gets warmer and warmer. But one thing that we are not looking at with so many details at what is going to happen with tropical species. What's going to happen for these species that in several parts of their range, they're facing their thermal limits, and they're really understudied on that aspect. So that's one of the things that drove me to do that. And we kind of got lucky here because until last year, so this is the BioOracle. That's an incredible database for environmental data that has data for climate change scenarios. And until last year, the last version, we only have the not updated climate projections from CMIP 5, and only 4 variables in their data set that we could model the distribution of the species. And when we started talking about doing that, and that kind of bothered me most of the time, these climate projections are so old, and we have only 4 variables. And then in this year, in February this year, they released this new updated and improved databases. Already with the social shared economic pathways, that's the most updated climate change projections, and with 14 variables for the marine environment. So that was the kind of the perfect storm. Let's do this now. That will be interesting. But of course, at this scale, we would need to gather all Guiana dolphin specialists. And of course, I guess you can imagine that was pretty hard because people are always they're doing a lot of stuff, and it's hard sometimes to meet for a coffee. Imagine put more than 40 people, let's do this, let's share data, let's talk about all of this stuff. But that was really rewarding. And I agree when Mauricio said that if this study don't get published anywhere, just to get these people together to share their data, to share their expertise was really amazing. So that's what we did. For some reason, I got this challenge for myself. So I tried to talk to several people. I just, this is the co-author list. There's a lot of people, 47 people, almost all specialists in Guiana dolphins, from southern Brazil to Honduras. That was really interesting. I didn't put the title here, so I wouldn't give you a spoiler. Okay, so based on that, what was our objectives? So the first question we had was to understand how climate change would affect the distribution of Guiana dolphins. And for that, we used 3 climate scenarios. We used 3 climate scenarios to contrast the mitigation strategies that each scenario has. So the first 2 scenarios, we are talking about scenarios that are mitigated, that somehow we are going to decrease the consumption rate, the economic growth, the release of greenhouse gases, and another scenario that everything goes bad. So in this optimistic scenario, we have the best scenario when we are decreasing a lot our consumption, population growth, and emissions. The intermediate is the scenario where we are doing exactly as we are doing now, but at some point later in the century, we are going to slow down. And the pessimistic, as I said, only bad things. Okay, so based on this objective, we have 2 hypotheses. So based on the premise that unmitigated climate scenarios are expected to alter more intensely the environment, of course, we would expect that Guiana dolphin would lose range under the most pessimistic scenarios. And our second hypothesis is based on the premise that we are already observing and projecting species range and species richness loss around the equator. We would expect that would have a greater range contraction in areas around the equator. And based on these results, our second question was how the network of current marine protected areas would overlap the distribution, the current distribution of Guiana dolphins, but also the future distribution. How far, how strong would be this mismatch? And for that, since several populations are already facing this spatial mismatch at local scales, if we got in this large scale and climate change scenarios, we would expect these MPAs will insufficiently cover Guiana dolphin distribution. Okay, so how we did that? So all of these people, hard work, a lot of sun on our heads, capturing data and getting funds for that. So a lot of that's awesome to see everybody here. This is just a small sample of all the people that were here. So as I pointed out for you guys, this is Mauricio, more than 10 years ago, a young kid. So that's so nice to have worked with all of these people, and they were very kind, very helpful to bring their expertise, their experiences. Is very challenging, but at the same time, each one of these people know way better what's going to happen in their areas, in their study areas, right? I couldn't, even if I'm reading a lot of literature, I couldn't get their experience in each of these local populations. So that's one thing that was very important for us to discuss the results was that, to have their experiences. So we gathered all these people that went for 8 countries. Our data set then went for more than 4 decades, and we had 47 Guiana dolphin specialists here. So this is, as far as I know, this is the most comprehensive database for this species. So it's good that we have enough data to model their distribution and try to understand the effects of climate change. So based on these occurrence records and the new and improved environmental data sets, what we did then, I would just try to quickly do a quick overview, just to point out some interesting aspects that I find in this framework. So we got this expert occurrence records. We then just filter because to avoid spatial autocorrelation. Since we didn't have absences for several parts over their range, we just generated 3 sets of pseudo absence, and then run 5 different algorithms. And with these algorithms, we combine them in ensemble models. So we did a 3-fold cross-validation. We divide our data set in training and testing and ran that 10 times. So we generated 450 models, took the predictions of the best models, and then combined them in one single ensemble model. That's what the literature of SDM is doing for more than 1 decade. And ensemble models has been interesting for that, to remove uncertainties and to have different perspectives. So the first thing that was nice in this framework is that for the whole species, we had an overall overview of what are the variables that were more important for the species and how they influenced. And based on that, since we have this information after this step, then I return to all the experts and ask, does that make sense for you? You that work in this bay during that time, is this relationship between the species and the environment make sense for you based on your experience, on the knowledge you have in Guiana dolphins? So we did an expert validation for that. And again, that took us a long time discussing, no, this is wrong, I don't like this. So we come back and adjust the parameters and do a lot of stuff. Then later, after everybody or most of people are sufficiently okay, I'm comfortable with that, then we validated this output and then started to do the projections. And the third step of this framework that I think is very interesting is that by doing all of these steps, we could quantify the amount of area that is predicted to be lost in all of these 3 different scenarios. Then we'll have a quantitative analysis and results. Okay, so let's go to the results because I'm already talking too much. So in the present, what our models are predicting? So dolphins are predicted to occur closer to the coast, in warm waters, and associated to estuaries. So the local pattern that we look in different bays, they are corroborate in the distribution of the species. But when we look at the map with more details, one thing that was really interesting to look that is that our model is predicting a much more fragmented distribution than we previously thought. So just to explain a little bit, all the areas in green are suitable areas. The models is indicating as suitable, and all the red areas are unsuitable. And this line is the Guiana dolphins IUCN polygon. So based on the IUCN polygon, we kind of can think that it's a continuous distribution from southern Brazil to Honduras. So gathering the most comprehensive database that we already have, our models doesn't predict that. It's predicting several areas that we don't have any part of suitable habitats. So that was interesting. And the other part, the other feature is that when we compare the predicted distribution of our ensemble model with the IUCN polygon, it's completely different. Several of us already doesn't like this crazy distribution. It's completely nonsense because it includes Guiana dolphins at 1,000 meters of depth. That is impossible. No Guiana dolphins was seen of more than 100 meters. So that in that part, with that study, we could quantify. So our predicted distribution is 3 times smaller than the IUCN range. And since this range extension is a feature to evaluate extinction risk, that is available information. But what about the main information, main question? How climate change affected their distribution? So remember we had 3 scenarios, right? So in the optimistic scenario, our data showed that they're predicted to lose 23% of the range in the optimistic scenario. So what these maps tell us in this legend here is that all of the red pixels here are areas that in the present, they are suitable, and in the future, in this scenario, are predicted to be unsuitable, so they're losing range. All the yellow parts are areas that are suitable in the present and continue to be suitable in the future. And all the small blue areas here are areas that were unsuitable in the present and are now suitable in this future scenario. So the models predict systematic loss, range loss in the Caribbean Sea and northeastern Brazil. As climate change intensifies, we're going to see that the same trend continues. So all of these red arrows indicate areas that we are losing a lot of range, right? So when we go to the intermediate scenario, we increase this loss to 37.5%. And now the red arrows are areas that are predicted to be lost in this intermediate scenario, but it was not lost in the optimistic one. So are new areas that are predicted to be lost in this scenario. And the same color terminology still works here. And what about the pessimistic scenario? In the pessimistic scenario, we are talking about almost half of the species range is going to be lost. And again, we have more areas in Suriname and French Guiana, new areas that's going to be lost in Venezuela. Panama, that was an area that until now was kind of stable, is now losing some area. And in Brazil, it's going to almost to the southeastern part of Brazil. So that tells us first that we have a much more fragmented distribution than we thought, as our models predict. And especially as we expected, the areas around the equator, they are losing more area. And the species that is an indicative that species may be on the thermal limits there. But more importantly for me here is that we have in some areas like northeastern Brazil, like some parts of Venezuela and Suriname and French Guiana, we have large patches of areas with no suitable habitats. And that now in the current times, in the present, we have resident populations there. And in all of these scenarios, not even close to that areas will be suitable. So that's really important to highlight. At the same time, I don't know if you guys notice it, and I didn't say specifically to talk about this. If you look at southeastern Brazil here, they were yellow, they were stable throughout all scenarios. Optimistic, intermediate, and pessimistic scenarios, all of these areas continue to be suitable in all of these projections, right? So that seems especially because these areas are really environmentally stable, especially for sea surface temperatures and salinity. So this can be a very important area for this species. But at the same time, we have to remember that these populations here, especially in southeastern Brazil, it's the populations where they face much more challenges, much more human pressure. It's not happening for Costa Rica. So when I talked about with Laura, my colleague, about this, she said, yeah, here we don't have that much pressure. But here, southeastern Brazil, we have a lot of that pressure. So that's important to keep in mind. And just going to the end, when we're talking about our marine protected areas, we have a general trend that this coverage of marine protected areas along Guiana dolphins range is also decreasing as climate change intensifies. In the present, we have 21.6% of their area covered, but that goes down, down, down as climate change gets worse. So this is optimistic, intermediate, and the pessimistic scenario. But more importantly is that what type of MPA is that? If we are looking only at the MPAs that have the higher ability to mitigate the human activities that are more restrictive in terms of the extractive activities, we are looking at only at this part. Then we have in the present only 1.8% of this area protected, and this will get worse until less than 1%. Okay, so just to finish my take-home messages, Guiana dolphins are predicted to lose suitable habitats in all the scenarios. The Caribbean Sea and northeastern Brazil are vulnerable, and management strategies have to look with a lot of attention to that part. Costa Rica and southeastern Brazil may play a really important climate refuge role, but the current human pressures there must be mitigated, and MPAs are insufficient to cover their distribution. And because of that, we also need to incorporate climate change in their plans, because we are seeing that the distribution will change and the MPAs won't be enough to protect. But if I can, this is my last slide, trying to be positive here. If we look backwards, if we take the pessimistic scenario and think about if we do our jobs well, if we can mitigate the influence of climate change, only for Guiana dolphins, we have the potential to protect at least half of this area. They are predicted to lose half of their range if we can mitigate climate change. So I think that's a very strong message, because it sends clearly a quantitative result, especially because we have a lot of meetings that this kind of stuff are discussed. Now we are having one of them, actually. So we are having the Biodiversity Conference of the United Nations, that's in Colombia, and they will be discussing this kind of stuff. So here we have, if we can mitigate this climate change, we can reduce their impacts, right? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. I appreciate it. I will open it up for questions, and we'll start with any questions online. Okay, so if you have any questions online, please put them into the chat box, and we'll get to them. How about questions in the room? I see Dawn. Will you meet me halfway?
Thank you. That was really impressive to see all of that brought together. Really cool work. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you, especially at this sort of really large scale, if there were certain species environment relationships that were driving those just range loss scenarios. Like, I mean, temperature is an obvious projected change, but you said you looked at, 14 different variables. And so are there certain really key habitat features across the entire range of Guiana dolphins that are particularly impacted under these different scenarios?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, though. We look at it, we didn't use the 14 variables because several of them were correlated or have multicollinearity issues. So in the end, I think we used 7 of them. And sea surface temperature and salinity were really important. So as waters were getting warmer, animals were losing range, but salinity was also very important, especially in the northeastern part of Brazil, where they were losing a lot of area too. But in the Caribbean Sea, temperature was clearly changing a lot and making the dolphins contract their ranges. One thing that's an interesting question too, because one thing that I especially were really surprised was Costa Rica. I wouldn't expect that Costa Rica in all scenarios were continuing to be stable. So when I looked at the temperature were increasing. When I look at the salinity, we have some variation, but the currents somehow there was really stable. So talking to oceanographers there, and Laura, and it seems that they have a counterclockwise gyre there, that in all of these climate change scenarios, they will continue to be. And that could be a way of still getting a lot of food in this area. So that's our potential explanation for that. But that's very interesting. Thank you for the question.
Other questions in the room?
Awesome talk. I guess, can you expand? So like warming makes sense to me if it was a fish, but they're warm-blooded already. So I guess, is the worry about warming just related to food, or can you kind of expand why you're worried about warming in dolphins?
Yeah, I think that, of course, food, fish will change. We did not include any kind of biotic variables in our model. That would be interesting too. And of course, these warmer waters may drive fish away. But in these areas near the equator, these animals may be facing their thermal limits because of the blubber, because of their activities. So of course that we cannot say if these animals at that temperature, they are like in a hot tub or anything like this. But, and they face a greater variation. For example, in northeastern Brazil and some parts of the Caribbean, the waters will be much more than 30 degrees Celsius. So I think that's a lot, even for a dolphin. But yeah, we cannot certainly say that what a 35-degree water would do with that species, but I think at least it won't be comfortable, I think.
Sorry, a follow-up that I didn't even think of. So do you guys know what the internal temperatures of dolphins are? Like, because like humans run a lot hotter than the
I think
environment
people
we're
in
in.
this room will know, but I don't know. Yeah, we can talk more about that. I don't know.
Okay, cool.
But that's a great question. We'll look at it.
So I had a question about, it seems like you're alluding to the fact that we're missing the multiple stressor component in this model.
Yeah.
So is that something that's the next steps, or what are you thinking about on this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cinnamon. And that's a really difficult question, actually, because
You're welcome.
because for me at least, it's very hard to disentangle these effects. So when we model only thinking about the climate, we can say or we can predict that climatically will be unsuitable. If everything else continues the same pace, let's say it doesn't change, climatically will be unsuitable. So on top of that, we're still getting fishing, we're still getting shipping and all this stuff. So how to include that in the model or in an analytical framework, we can do that in several different situations, but we would have to guess what would be the future for these activities. For example, I could do that if I can model the fishing inside this objective. If I say that fishing will be double as common as now, but I don't know if that would happen. I know that based on the climate projections that people all over the world are doing, we have these trajectories along the centuries for different scenarios. But for human stressors, it's hard to think about what's going to happen in the future. We can like do that and suppose that this is 2 times worse, 3 times worse, or not. But I think that's very important to do. At least it's a first wake-up call that climatically it's already bad, and we are not thinking about the human stresses that are already happening.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking too in the suitable ranges, that's probably a range. It's not just this perfect suitable, right? And so then on the edges of those suitable ranges, are we at tipping points with the human impacts?
Yeah. So one of the things that I didn't have time to here to talk, that Clarissa, we were discussing about it. So in the southern range of the species and the northern range of the species, here, see, I learned what you taught me.
job.
Here and here, we have bottlenose dolphins. Throughout Sotalia distribution, Guiana dolphin distribution, we don't have Guiana dolphins. It seems to be Guiana dolphins kind of take that environment. It doesn't let anybody come closer. So in Santa Catarina, here really on the edge, we have Guiana dolphins, and here we have Guiana dolphins. So if these species extend their range, they could get more aggressive interactions with bottlenose dolphins, because this is already documented. Bottlenose dolphins and Guiana dolphins here in the southern Brazil to be aggressive with each other. So that's other component that's very interesting. What would happen? They could go there or not because of bottlenose dolphins.
It looks like we have a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Thank you for the presentation. Can you explain the difference between the red unsuitable areas in the white buffer of IUCN species range? Why was the white zone not considered unsuitable?
Yeah, thank you. So all of the IUCN range are that area that the experts gather together and do this extent of occurrence area. So this is kind of old actually. And when we look at the biology of the species and this IUCN range, these are areas that are not used by the species. Like I said, like 1,000 meters deep, 2,000 meters deep. So we model their distribution here. We didn't use the Guiana dolphin IUCN as a whole, but we did almost all this area to see if this polygon would make sense or not. And then our models are predicting that they, as we see, as we observe, that they're not going that deep, that far away from the coast. So all of these green areas are the areas where the model predicts based on the relationship of the species with the environment that are suitable. And all the red areas are areas where the species are unsuitable, where it's unsuitable for the species. I don't know if I correctly responded.
All right, I think we have another question in the room. Clarissa?
Hi, Rodrigo. Congratulations. Yeah, you kind of mentioned my question actually about I'm still kind of intrigued about the Southern population in Florianopolis, in Bahia Norte being stable because it's the limit. First is the limit of the distribution. They cannot go forward to Argentina. So I was thinking, and this is my ignorance in these models, could you include like the how the climate change could affect the mangrove areas in this model? Like, could you include this information? Because I think that this is highly associated with on the distribution of Guiana dolphins, right? Because they are coastal and they rely on prey sources that are connected to the mangrove areas, and it's like nursery for all the fish species. And one thing that I was thinking is because this population, when we submitted the foraging paper with the Bahia Norte, they were already competing with bottlenose dolphins for prey sources. And this is now.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about like this competition? And could you also include in this model like sympatric species, like areas throughout their distribution where they have other sympatric cetacean species?
Yeah, thank you, Clarissa. That's, again, very hard but interesting questions. So we can include the mangrove as a habitat there. I think we would have maybe several pixels with no information. I don't think we had a lot of mangrove studies throughout at least Brazil, as far as I know, but we don't have them as well mapped as we would like. So that's a challenge too. But somehow that was a discussion we had in our group. But when we included distance from the coast and salinity, somehow indirectly, I think we got a little bit of this. So, but of course, mangrove are very important, especially for the southeastern populations in Brazil. And that was very interesting because then Carol, another specialist in Guiana dolphin, northeastern Brazil, said no, northeast, there's not any kind of relationship clear with that. They're really coastal. They're on the beach almost, and estuaries and all this stuff. It's not that probably important at this area. So that was fantastic because for me, interesting. So that validation by the experts were very interesting. And about including another species in these models and similar ones, that is our next step, our next logical step. We did that for Steno bredanensis. We modeled their distribution, climate change scenarios, and 3 prey. And it was interesting because there was a mismatch or prey losing area at the same time that dolphins were losing area. And I thought about doing this for Sotalia, for Guiana dolphins, but then I didn't have time for But I think it would be very, very interesting. But we would have my problem, the challenge that we're going to face here is to have a prey that will be common in terms of frequency and range. Because, for example, sardines, they eat a lot of sardines, but there are no sardines in French Guiana, in Suriname, in Colombia. So have to check that. That would be great. Yeah.
All right, looks like we have a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Rodrigo, the models considered the surface temperature, but the conditions in deeper waters may be different even for the coastal zone standard. How can we consider these dimensions of the water column?
That's a great question. Yes, we did consider only the surface temperature, and we could consider the temperature in the bottom, but they were correlated in the model. So I kind of have to do a choice. So I did choose the sea surface temperature, and I know that there can be a variation in that, but in several of these waters that are very shallow, like 10 meters deep, 15 meters deep, maybe the difference is not that far, right?
All right, we're going to take just a couple more questions here. I have some people that are.
Yay, thank you for an amazing talk. My question, I hope, is quick, which is, I don't know how IUCN range decisions get made, but it seems like a really obvious step forward from your work is that range is not right. And you guys now have so many, 47 people who
Yeah.
in that map. So do you have plans, or is there a way that you can use this to improve that range designation?
Yeah, I think we are going to do that and try to see the best channels. But this mismatch between the distribution of the species in IUCN is not new, actually, for dolphins. Like, there are a lot of birds studies that shows that the IUCN range is much larger and the species not considered as extinct. But then when we look at the data, it's much more restricted. And I talked to several people about them, and one of my supervisors in the PhD was Stuart Pym, that do a lot of this stuff, and he beat IUCN all the time. But yeah, we are going to talk to them and see the best channel to let's look at this. What do you think? Does that make sense to have a more shallow distribution, more close to the coast? Yeah, thanks.
All right, we're going to wrap up with one more question from Lee.
Yeah, this is kind of a different topic. Well, anyway, great talk. Good job. So this has to do with the fact that you did put in so much effort to bring all this data and all these collaborators together. And part of me, my question is, was it worth it?
Mhm.
And the reason I ask that is from a deep SDM modeling sort of vision of it. So in listening to you answer these questions, you've been talking about the nuances in each population's prey habitat, resource use. And so I'm wondering, what we can do in SDMs is we can build a model for this and population and see how it, extrapolates to another.
Yeah.
What you've done here is kind of different. You've kind of all aggregated it together. And so, there's two ways, right? One is that when you extrapolate the model, maybe it doesn't work at all. Another would be what you did is that sort of take the average conditions and, both have their strengths and both have their weaknesses. And I guess part of my question is, you're set up really well to try and test that modeling approach, like having, particular models for particular areas and seeing how they extrapolate, where they break down. And, because anyway, it goes back to that question, was it worth it, to build this one big model for the whole range versus thinking about it more geographically specific? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a great question. So trying to answer if worth it, I think it did. it was a lot of work. But in the end, I think, as I was saying, that I think I got much more refined validation and experience from these people to understand their distribution as a whole. That for that aspect was incredible. And about the scales, I agree with you that it's different when we are focusing on the population or the distribution of the whole species, and we can extrapolate by doing that or not. But my impression is that most of the studies we have modeling the habitat use or distribution of Guiana dolphins are on these local scales. So we have several populations where we have these relationships between species and environment, where are the areas they are using more. But here I wanted to look at the bigger picture. So what happens if we got all of these people, the whole range of the species, what would happen? And the more data was important, for example, because if we go on an online database, we have almost nothing on Guiana dolphins. All the Caribbean Sea, we have nothing of data, available data there. We have some populations here in the southeastern that we have data, available data. And when I got all the records from all the people, I had more than 1,000 records. And I said, oh my God, that's beautiful. But when I did a spatial rarefaction, and I think we were very conservative in doing that, we only considered records close to each other with 30 kilometers. So if we have a record here and another here with 10 kilometers, we would exclude that and only consider this range to avoid any kind of grouping there. And then we got less than 200 records, because most of our effort are really concentrated in these small populations. So I think thinking of this big picture is really worth it to bring everybody together in the boats. Would I do it again? I don't know. That's a different question because it takes a lot of time. But yeah, I think so. I'm just crazy. Thanks.
Nice. Well, we are past our time, so why don't we give one more round of applause for.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks for being here. I hope to see you on Wednesday for our Science on Tap and next Thursday as well. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.